Hello, Magnus. Happy May, which we're calling Horror Musical Month. I think that's what I called it. I gave it a really long title when I previewed it to someone, and I was like, that's so many words. So,
But I think it gets the point across quite nicely. Horror
yeah.
musical month.
I mean,
Uh,
so the first question I'm going to ask is when we say horror musical, what do you think of when you hear the phrase horror musical? If you do.
mm. Now, unfortunately, my mind instantly goes to the most well-known classic within that range, which is Rocky Horror. But
Sure.
there is others. I quite enjoyed Shock Treatment, its sequel. I think it was a bit ahead of its time when it came out.
Yes.
Um, ooh, what was the? My mind's gone blank. I do apologize.
That's okay. So horror musicals could also include something like Phantom of the Paradise, which was
Yes.
a rock version of Phantom of the Opera, kind of.
Mm.
Horror musicals could also include the famously cast by David Hasselhoff, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde musical. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it's wild.
Heard of it, not seen it, sadly.
It's wild. And
Mm.
so there are, of course, there are the kind of the big ones, and one of the big ones we're going to be talking about later this month. But we're going to start off with kind of a lesser known new horror musical that is both a cult classic and
Mm.
also isn't quite as loved as it probably wants to be. And so this is not considered a horror musical, but it's considered a horror rock opera, which is kind of a different genre. And so
Mm.
that's how I call it a horror musical. Wikipedia describes it as a horror rock opera. And because it's
Yes.
classically composed and it has a lot of hard rock influences and kind of black metal influences, I feel like
Mm.
it is more of a rock opera. I think of this as less kind of in the tradition of the horror musical, and I do think it's more in the tradition of kind of generational musicals, as I call them. So I'm thinking
Mm.
about Tommy's The Who. I'm thinking about Hair, which completely changed the landscape of Broadway in the 60s. And so we're going to be talking today about Repo, the Genetic Opera, because we can't feel nothing at all, just like most of the cast of this film. And
Yeah.
also, I've never seen the stage musical. I didn't see it when it traveled because it didn't come to any of the cities I lived in, and I was not ready for it in 2002. Um, but what's interesting is this is probably the most traditional movie musical to come out in a long while because it followed the schematic of occurring fans the way that the late MGM musicals did, like Dr. Dolittle and
Mm.
Gigi. But it's definitely made for a certain type of audience, a type of audience affected by 9/11, affected by what was going to be the 2008 bank foreclosures.
Mm.
Um, and it's a very teenage sort of musical. The ingenue at the center of it, Alexa Vega, her character Shiloh Wallace,
Mm.
has become 17 and is now doing the teenage thing, no longer listening to her father, who just happens to be the head of Repo Men. And so this kind of dystopian cyberpunk movie, musical, horror, rock
Mm.
opera, evangelism. Uh,
Oh,
there's circus elements to
yes.
it, which we'd see in Devil's Carnival, which
Hmm.
is the unofficial sequel. There's the comic book element, which is something Terrence the Dudnik was doing in
Mm.
between when he started writing it in 2002 with his partner and when it became a movie. And so all of the interstitials that have that comic book feel come from his past as a storyboard artist. Um, it's Repo the Genetic Opera. Thoughts? We'll start with base thoughts on Repo the Genetic Opera.
I think what immediately strikes you about Repo is you watch it and it's such a melting pot of all sorts of different ideas and influences. It's certainly its own beast altogether, but you look at it and you've got all this gothic symbolism and such. You could see why it's a contemporary of other sort of dystopian noir horror comics like Sin City and such. You could see like like where it's sort of leaned in with the whole musical tropes of we mentioned Phantom before. Uh
Yeah.
oh, I forget her name. Ceylon? The main the virgin main character.
Shiloh. Her name is
Yeah.
Shiloh, which really
Shiloh.
does roll off the tongue musically. Also, it's Shiloh
Oh.
with only one H. There's no H at the end on Shiloh. I always thought there was, but apparently it's Shiloh without the second H on the end, which is a choice. Not one I would have made. I would just turn the silent H on, but I'm not Terrence, so who knows?
Well, she is basically channeling the lead character from Phantom all the way through with her portrayal. Um, at the same time, like there is some comparisons to be made between how she and oh, I forget her name. I've got it. You know, you can hear the song in your head
Yeah.
that's saying
So you've got so you're thinking of Sarah Brightman as Blind Mag, I'm guessing.
no, 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 the Phantom's main
Oh,
character.
Christine. Christine is the
Ah,
name
that's
of the
it.
Phantom of the Opera's
I, c-
ingenue, the title character of the show, Christine. And also
I could
her best friend is Meg in that show, so technically it's very close.
I could hear Gerard Butler singing Christine, Christine, but
Oh
I couldn't
man,
quite get it out of my head.
sidebar on that. When you hire someone to play Phantom, they have to be able to hit those high notes. And Gerard
Yeah.
Butler was great casting physically, but you got to get like Ramin Karimloo to hit the high notes. Because Phantom has some pretty high songs, but we can talk about that when we talk about Phantom of the Opera, because that was a whole movement the summer that came out. Everybody was watching
Mm,
Phantom. Not
yeah.
everybody was watching Repo the Genetic Opera. It was both not for everyone, and also they were so hell bent on not doing
Mm,
traditional advertising that it
yeah.
almost impeded its own cult status because you had to kind of be in the know about it because we didn't have the internet culture that we have now
Mm,
in 2008. So even in 2002, when they started writing it, when it premiered
mm,
at Fantasia in Montreal, it was still a very underground movement. And if you didn't happen to be in one of the 8 cities they did the musical in, the stage version, you didn't have to happen to be in one of the 20 cities the roadshow went to with the movie for the one night premiere. You didn't hear about it until Lionsgate released it. And unlike now, when we have like A24 and Project
mm,
Veritas doing horror movies, in 2008, Lionsgate was really the only main studio I can think
mm,
of that was doing horror movies. In fact, Bill Moseley, who is in this film, would
mm,
go on to work both with Rob Zombie and with pictures done in Lionsgate. I think him and one of the other cameo characters that gets murdered is actually in one of the Saw or Hostel films, which are also Lionsgate, if I remember correctly.
mm.
So it's kind
Oh,
of like
mm.
Lionsgate was doing a thing for Saw, but with a movie musical, essentially.
I have a little comment to make about that, and then I do want to hear what your own sort of overview thoughts
Sure.
are, good sir. I was going to say, you said about them not doing a lot of advertising for this.
Yeah.
I wonder whether that ties in with the film's quite fierce spirit, its subversive nature, and not and sort of like it's because the entirety of this film is critical about certain modern trends and such. The whole thing about like corporatism and such, about people being scandalized by things like surgery and drug use and the like. And I wonder if that was just a choice that they didn't want to go down like what is seen as the mainstream way of promotion for their
Yeah.
film. Mm,
Uh, Terrence Dudnick's whole body of work is about that.
mm,
There are other things it's about, but when he promotes his work, especially,
mm,
people seem to vividly recall his kind of militant idea of pushing structures of new ways of consumption for the audience. For instance,
mm,
The reason Repo didn't get a sequel and the reason we got Devil's Carnival was because even though Devil's Carnival ended up on Amazon Prime, and so did Alleluia, the sequel to Devil's Carnival, um, the only way to get a cast album for Repo the Genetic Opera was through iTunes for a long time. It might be different now that we especially have the Blu-ray. I think a vinyl version of Repo the Genetic Opera would sound amazing.
Mm.
If there's a vinyl version, I don't actually know. I've done absolutely no work on that. But so in comments Terrence had made, it really does seem like he wanted this to be called. He has, and other people have talked about this, the comparison to Rocky Horror Picture Show, the people that do this in a shadow cast style, the same way people do Rocky Horror, where they dress up in costumes and they do it live in
Mm.
theaters. But I've also heard rumors about how much Terrence hates that it wasn't bigger than Rocky, that it didn't immediately grab cult status. And I never met Terrence, but I've heard he's both wonderful and I've heard he's awful from a variety of people. So I don't actually know what he wants, and if I ever meet him, I will ask. But I will say he does have a very distinct brand, both in style of what he does and
Mm.
how he gets people to watch it. It's also interesting because for me, he's kind of the anti Rob Zombie, where Rob Zombie's movies always feel a little too short, a little too much like a music video. His always feel too expansive and not enough like a music video. So
Mm.
where Rob Zombie, like his House of a Thousand Corpses or the one with the Antichrist, feels too short and a little self-serving, here the backstage stuff with Paris Hilton being basically cast as herself, the rumors about Terrence the Dudnik kind of being a jerk to people that love Repo, but also those could just be people crapping on Terrence the Dudnik. I don't actually know. It's one of those things like there is a culture around this film that
Mm.
draws people in and they become part of the acting troupe. That he has like a Ryan Murphy kind of cult following actor to actor, like Paul Sorvino is in Repo, and then he's also in both parts of Devil's Carnival. I think that might have been one of the last things he did before he died. Actually, was probably working with Terrence Dudnik. Alexa Vegas followed him. Sean Patrick Flannery followed into Devil's Carnival.
Mm.
I think Sarah Brightman might be in Devil's Carnival. I don't know, but so he has this following all his own. Terrence Dudnik is not the only person that made this movie, by the way. Terrence Dudnik did have a writing partner, and I want to make sure they both get honored. His writing partner is in the film. His writing partner has a cameo role as the um, conductor in the at the opera tonight when the opera itself proper starts.
Darren
Uh,
Smith.
Darren Smith, thank you. I was frantically scrolling trying to find the name. So Darren Lynn Bousman also has a cameo role in this film, who directed it. But this Repo Genetic Opera traditionally just given to Terrence Dudnik alone. It's technically written by a writing team of Darren and Terrence, and it used to be that um, when they did this as a stage show, Darren Smith would play all of the instruments, and Terrence Dudnik would like play all the parts until they started accruing actors, which does include, by the way, in the original stage version of this, Michael Rooker, who would go on to have many wonderful roles, including Yondu. He played the Anthony Stewart Head role, so he was the original
Ah.
Repo Man. I don't know how many songs he had then, because a lot of the songs that the Nathan has in this film really do feel like Anthony Stewart Head was written to sing them. They're right in his vocal range. He doesn't strain on any of the growling parts. His descent into madness is pitch perfect.
Mm.
And coming on the heels of the end of the Buffy the Vampire Slayer TV show, Repo the Genetic Opera is an incredible way to continue not just his fan base, but also to move back into theater and opera, which is
Mm.
what he was doing before Buffy, anyways. I think this is the perfect rock opera for a place and time. So I talk about Tommy and I talk about Hair. I think Repo fits for the generation it's made for.
Mm.
I will say I do not think it's perfect. I do agree with some critics that say there are places that it drags. I don't think it drags everywhere they think it does. I
Mm.
do think some of the songs could be improved. I actually got in an argument with somebody once over Mark It Up because I find that song it's fine plot wise, but it's not a good song on its own, and they disagree with me. So there are people that actively still kind of debate about the merits of this movie. This movie has a following. If I go into
Mm.
a crowd of like musical people and and I start shouting about glass vials and guns pressed against anatomy, about a third of the crowd is going to start singing Zydrate along with me. So there are some infectious, wonderful hits, including Assassin Murder Monster, which I always
Mm.
thought was Sexy Murder Monster. No matter how many times I hear the song, I always hear Anthony Stewart Head saying Sexy Murder Monster and having people like whispering it behind him. And I don't know if that's intentional or not, but I love that you can read that into it. I do love the dystopian feel. I love the idea that the corruption of Earth and their obvious version of New York, which has no more bridges, so you can't leave it. It's very self contained. It does feel like a reference to there are two other horror films called Repo Men that are vaguely dystopian, but they're not musicals. And so Repo the Genetic
Mm.
Opera really does feel like it sits in a good time and space. It's made for like a 17-year-old dystopian cyberpunk. I do think this does push the boundaries a little bit on kink, so it is made for people with a queer bent, both overt and a little bit on the inside. It is
Mm.
very it's not like Saw or Hostel where it feels gratuitous, but it is very gory. It's very upfront. It does kind of. I like it. I like the idea of this candy coated horror almost. And you don't think of this as candy coated, but the way that it presents the slicing of skin with the scalpel, the way that it
Mm.
takes out the skull, it takes out the spine, in the beginning, the whole chase scene, which is kind of the opening of the movie, which
Mm.
isn't the opening of the stage show. Apparently, when they were writing the movie, they actually switched a lot of the songs around. So Things You See in a Graveyard wasn't split. Uh, the Repo Man song at the beginning is actually the end of the musical, I guess. I've never seen it live, so
Oh.
I'm going by what I've heard on Wikipedia. But for this movie specifically, the order of songs and how they're split, Things You See
Mm.
in a Graveyard is probably what Things You See in a Graveyard with 21st Century Cures is probably one of the best rock opera songs I've heard in a long while. There's lots of good
Mm.
parts. It really does. Even something like At the Opera Tonight really does feel like it's both honoring West Side Story, but it's also trying to reinvent kind of that quintet, different spaces into one voice structure. It does have torch songs in it. It has kind of that fatal opera feel of where people die at the end.
Mm.
And of course, when you have someone at the caliber of Sarah Brightman, you have to give her an actual like opera piece to sing, and Chromagia, where she loses her eyes in an unsettling, graphic but very satisfying sequence, is kind of the most amazing crucifixion scene since Tommy to me, because it's a crucifixion
Mm.
scene. She's lifted up into the air, her arms are
Mm.
open, right to the point she takes her eyes out, and then she's like impaled on a fence. And she knows she's going to die, so she's doing it on her own terms. And in Tommy, when people can't make themselves deaf, dumb, and blind like him in order to succeed at pinball, they
Mm.
essentially crucify him. It's much more graphic in the show than it is in the movie musical. But Tommy is a whole nother movie musical to talk about later. But the the religious references are much closer in Tommy and Repo than in Hair and Repo. So I see a lot of what I liked about Tommy also in Repo, which is why I kind of marry the two together in time and space.
Mm. Would you say that there is a theme of rebellion within this film? Um, and from different angles and different characters. You've got I'm going to mispronounce the name again. Ceylon, Ceylon,
Shiloh.
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 I have to keep remembering Shia LaBeouf, something like that. Silo, so I can
Actual
remember.
cannibals, Shiloh Wallace. That'd be great. She does like collect
Because
and mount
yeah,
bugs as like her one hobby. It's weird even in this universe because there's no reason she should be going out to a graveyard to collect bugs. So there is something kind of Shia LaBeouf actual cannibal about Shiloh Wallace, if we're honest with ourselves.
well, yeah, even the innocent virgin character of this movie has quirky, subversive tastes. You
Yeah,
know, Th- but the whole world seems to have gone on a tilt, or at the end of the day. So, well,
yeah. Tilt
but
is generous. Tilt is good. It's a generous word for
yeah.
what happens in dystopia.
But you've got so what I mean about rebellion is you've got her rebellion against her father as she's trying to become her own person. You've got Meg's rebellion against the corporate overlords, as it were, who, really run this city as pretty much sort of a corporate police state sort of thing, and have got everyone sort of like so heavily reliant on them to the point of like, any sign of rebellion must be stamped out. And then you've got I forget their names, Amber, uh, Luigi, and the one that wears the women's faces on his head.
Yeah, the FM.
You've
So
got, you've got
you've got Pavi, Amber,
that's the one,
and I think
Luigi.
his name is Largo. I have to
Is it
scroll down.
Largo? I thought it was
It
Luigi.
starts with an L. It's not Luigi. It does start with an L. It's a little easier to just actually.
Oh,
So
ah,
so no, you're right. So Bill Moseley plays Luigi, who is the
yeah,
eldest son. So that's Luigi, and then Carmela is Amber Sweet's real name. Carmela Largo is
yeah,
the one played by Paris Hilton, and then
mm,
Nivek Ogre is Pavi Largo. So I was half right.
yeah.
So yeah, there should be a
And their rebellion and their different personalities and antics against their father, um, he wants a worthy heir to keep, his empire afloat. Um, so I would ask you, do you think that rebellion is maybe one of the central themes for this film?
I think it's throughout, but I don't know if I'd call it a central thing. I think rebellion happens because of how this movie is set.
Mm,
So in college, I did a whole bunch. I did a whole bunch. I did a theater degree, obviously, for my undergrad. Um, and there's a whole subset of plays called revenge tragedies where everybody in it is kind of doomed the moment they enact revenge. And so there is an idea of rebellion here, but this whole story for me is a story of revenge and betrayal, even when you're trying your hardest. The reason that Nathan Wallace is so doomed from the beginning is that he's trying so hard to keep his daughter kind of cryogenically sealed in the like Mr. Freeze, Mrs. Freeze sort of way.
hmm
Um, that he's just been basically coasting on status quo, not realizing as a 17-year-old. I don't think Shiloh is self-actualized enough to do revenge. Even in the
mm,
closing song she has as she's pointing a gun at Paul Sorvino, it doesn't really feel like it has the hallmarks of like County Monte Cristo style revenge.
mm,
Um, it's clear that she loves her father very much, but she's just very frustrated. She is scared of going outside and chase the morning. She doesn't really ever approach Blind Mag. She never gets to touch Blind Mag, which is her link to her mom. Um, there's something about her that is naive enough that it makes sense that Joan Jett would do a cameo for her scene when she's like singing about being 17 and she's rebelling, but she doesn't really have the tools to rebel. None of the characters in this movie have good tools for rebellion. So it's like they're
yeah,
trying to do it, but they don't actually know how. Even Roddy, in rewriting his will, is doing it for Shiloh, without knowing anything about Shiloh, not really. Except for
Yeah.
kind of knowing about her existence, he's basically handing his company to someone who, if you listen to the song in the credits, Needle and a Bug, she becomes addicted to Zydrate after leaving. And that's one of the songs that was cut from the movie, but I think is probably in the stage show. This is
Mm.
supposed to be a series of films. This was supposed to be a trilogy, and it never got made. And so maybe by the time you get to the
Oh, I
third
don't know.
one, you get a full on rebellion because Alleluia, the sequel to Devil's Carnival, is basically about demons deciding they're going to take a train to heaven and destroy heaven and God. So maybe it's like building up to more rebellion, but I don't know, except for the fact that it's meant for kind of an audience testing rebellion, that I necessarily see rebellion as a theme. It's not
Hmm.
bad. People are definitely trying to go in a direction, but I don't know if it's strong enough to be called a theme necessarily. It is very present, though, which I appreciate.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Right. You're right. I mean, even when they try to take control of their situation and make a decision of their own, ultimately it does end in tragedy. The Meg
Yeah.
crucifixion is like a very strong example of that, but I don't think no one really gets a satisfactory ending
The only
within
person
this
that
film.
escapes this movie unscathed because they don't change at all is the grave robber. And Terrence Dudnik plays him as kind of this mystical, both in and out of time narrator, where he's breaking the fourth
Mm,
wall, but he's also interacting with characters. I don't know if that was supposed to happen, but it's one of those things
mm,
where Terrence Dudnik had probably been playing the Grave Arbor for so long. It could have
mm,
been where he just didn't realize it was even happening, but he's the only character that is not affected by anything in this movie. Like he's there, but he's like playing with the audience so much that he almost doesn't feel
yeah.
like he feels like he's part of the world, but that he could leave it at any moment and just kind of chooses abject poverty and living in a dumpster.
Mm, yeah. Mm. Oh, how depressing to think of this. This world is falling into doom and chaos, and well, maybe that it is exactly what the trilogy would have happened. Like
Yeah.
it's showing man's slow slide into, you know, doom, shall we say?
Well, so here's something really great about it. I
Mm,
know that the middle of this was supposed to be a prequel, so I don't know what the third Repo movie would have looked like. But in the comic book interstitials, especially in the introduction of Repo Man, we see a
mm,
whole bunch of Repo Men. One of them has like a wolf's head. These comic book interstitials, by the way they transition from scene to scene, I think they're great. The way that they play with Mag's eyes, like Blind Mag as sort of a proto superhero, was really cool. The way they flatten out Paris Hilton's body, so she goes from like sex animal to this almost 2D cartoon of a woman. The way
mm,
they really exaggerate Luigi and Pavi's figures, especially Pavi's face. This is where it starts getting into like the revenge tragedy. They basically took all of the tropes of the effeminate, sadistic French male aristocrat and shoved them into the younger brother. I don't know if
mm,
Terrence knew he was doing that. He has a writing background, so it's possibly new, but there's something very like French tragedy, Revenger's tragedy. I think the play, what's the play called? Women, be
oh,
women versus
uh,
women, something like that. There's a revenge tragedy play with the word
I
women in it. And I can't remember the
oh
name of it.
I know what you mean. It's touring the UK at the minute. I forget what it's called, but I know exactly what you're
Yeah.
talking about.
No,
Mm,
it's like so. There's something almost French about it. There's something even in this dystopia. There's something very decadent about this dystopia from the amount of bodies that are piled together that we see Terrence the Didnik like taking the Zydrate out of them with the needle.
hmm
The whole alley scene for Zydrate Anatomy is almost like anti verisimilitude. It's anti perfection, and yet it's like a clean, dirty street. The weird carnival thing that's in the middle of it, the testifying, evangelizing opera at the end, even Amber Sweet losing her face while essentially wearing a fake Marie Antoinette dress.
Yeah.
There's something very, it's very much a 2008 glamour kind of, for like a neo dystopian rotting glamour for a certain type of, like, not a hot topic teen, because I don't think that's fair, but there's something about this that would have really resonated with a teen looking for something different, who's maybe like, if your parents love Oklahoma,
Mm,
the most you can rebel is by loving Repo the Genetic Opera, because your parents aren't going to get it. Like, this is
yeah.
not like a movie, like, you have to love this as a teen to kind of love it as an adult, I feel like.
There was a real subculture of sort of like punky, rebellious, gothic skater music lovers from that era, if I remember correctly. Because that's when you had bands like Evanescence, and you had some people that were doing sort of like punky stuff, but in the mainstream. But
Yeah.
then you had others that were going like more hardcore with what they were doing and such. I feel that I wonder whether this movie was made for that type of person that wanted something that really went full in, with kind of taking those themes and going dystopian with
Yeah.
it. And
Well, because
like,
we'd had, in America, we'd had Slipknot for a while, but even the
mm,
guy that was in charge of Slipknot, I think it's by 2008 is when he did his
yeah,
Unmasked Stone Sour album. So people
mm.
were really experimenting within their own genres. I think in 2008 we were like between Garbage albums, like literally the band Garbage. Um, like, we were between Garbage albums. We weren't 2008. We weren't really big on, like, Juggalos, and St. Clown Posse was kind of an underground thing still, but there was kind of, because we didn't really have a rave culture in
No.
2008.
Mm,
So goth and kind of that, not quite Blade, but not quite dystopian in the way you see it in Repo. There would be that. It's a really hard thing to quantify, but it did. I can see it's for a certain sort of culture. It's very much like for TTRPG tabletop gaming, the people that really love Cyberpunk really love Shadowrun. Even
mm,
stuff that's new, like the new version of Misspent Youth. Like, you can really see that the idea of dystopia, but the idea of people within dystopia and how they react to having their agency taken from them, which is really what Shadowrun is about. It's the idea of being powerless against a corporation and how you would act if you had to act outside the bounds of the law. I think that's where
mm,
this movie falls short, because Shiloh is never really outside the bounds of law. She's never away from her father or Roddy or Mag or
mm.
anyone long enough to ever be outside the bounds of her own law. That's where the idea of her
Oh, okay.
rebelling falls a little short, because I think there's maybe 2 minutes in the entire movie where she is by herself, long enough to be by herself. Even when she's alone, she has a watch that Roddy gives her, and so
Mm,
she has his voice in her head. So her ability to rebel is inhibited by the fact that she is never alone, and Alexa Vega plays her well. Alexa Vega is not necessarily a standout in this movie because it's such a strong ensemble cast, but I think for what Shiloh offers, Alexa Vega did an incredible job, because it could have fallen really flat. If Shiloh falls and Nathan doesn't have a reason to, like, keep her in hiding, the whole movie falls flat.
yeah.
Um, so it really does work thanks to Alexa Vega in some manner.
Mm.
So
I want to mention about the cast in a moment, but you mentioned Alexa Vega, and I honestly just have to bring up the fact that I find it fascinating that, barely 4 to 5 years ago, previous to this, she was going full on cheese in Spy Kids.
yeah,
Like one of the films, perhaps the most polar opposite away from this that you can get, and then she just goes into this and she fully commits herself. Um, so I'm not sure like
I think
her reasoning behind it.
Repo is full cheese. I think Repo is something, if you
Oh well,
take it seriously, but it's in the
it's
other direction. But there is a certain level of cheese to Repo, I think.
oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, you're completely right. I mean, the over the top nature of like repossessing organs, the foundations of our lives and such is a big thing in itself.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, but I just find that fascinating as like a little thing. I'd love to know how she came to be in that role. That would be just something, for a personal thing.
I don't think she's ever shed, but I can imagine someone told her she would be in a movie with Sarah Brightman. And if you hear you're going to be in a movie with Sarah Brightman, like you jump at the offer. It's
Yeah.
also possible because one of the screenings of this movie was in Pasadena. It might have been possible
Mm.
she was just in LA, and
Yeah.
because Terrence and Darren had been previewing this show in Los
Mm.
Angeles for like 2 years before the movie was made. She might have been one of the people that saw it in a screening because she was one of the people cast in the stage show as it
Mm.
got further along in popularity. So it's possible she was just like one of the first members of the troupe and there was nobody else. I can't think of another actress I would trust to play Shiloh because you need that mix of innocence but with a backbone, and that's
Yeah.
really hard to cast well. I think Abigail
Mhm.
Breslin is the only other actress that could probably do it because by the time 2008 was out, Kirsten Dunst was just a little aged out of Shiloh, and I don't
Mm.
think Abigail was quite old enough to play Shiloh yet. So I think
Mm.
Alexa Vega is the only one that can really do justice to Shiloh and not get absolutely lost behind Anthony Stewart Head. So on this island of death, which is essentially definitely, unless it's San Francisco, it has to be New York just because of the shape of the bridges.
Mm.
Essentially, all of these big personalities live on this island of death, in which there is a group of people that are the haves, and then everybody else is the have-nots that are turning
Mm.
tricks or are bondage boyfriend police or are Gene Co cops or are the people repoing stuff. There's
Yes.
no in between. There's no middle class. There's the people that have been saved by Gene Co and the people that owe Gene Co everything and are going to die, including Blind Mag, I would argue. Um, so
Mm.
talk a little bit about Alexa Vega as Shiloh Wallace with one
Mm.
H for whatever reason. Um, Anything about Shiloh that you'd like to say beyond?
Um, the only thing I think I will note is I think her presence as a sort of wide-eyed newcomer into this world, because even though she's been born and raised in this world, she's pretty much been segregated away from everyone. So this is all entirely new to her, really. I think you kind of needed someone like that. Um, if it had been someone that was basically as involved in all the shenanigans going on, basically, it would have got they would have been an entirely different story altogether. She kind of serves as the perfect sort of centerpiece for this almost power struggle. I mean, the one person clearly has all the power in the city, but it's still a struggle between all of these different competing individuals and what they're after. Um, ultimately, I don't think anyone gets what they're after, but that kind of just fits in with what's happening, to be
As
honest.
as Bugs Bunny once said famously, "What did you expect? It's an opera." In the Bugs Bunny cartoon where he dies in his Brunhilde outfit.
Oh,
Interestingly enough, Alexa Vega as well is the only character whose style is really not dystopian. She has kind of this steampunk baby doll, harajuku, pure white mostly for the most part until she like puts a jacket on when she's like running away. She spends most of the movie bare from the knee down with this sort of like Victorian nightgown thing going on. Her
mm,
style really does stand out in the world, and it is partially because she is that virginal character. But it also, when they need shots when like there's going to be wind to create some sort of dramatic moment. The baby doll dress does a really good job of that. She's different
Mm.
than all of the lower caste subjugated people thirsting for Zydrate, but not by much. Um, when I think of this movie, I think of that scene of Shiloh like walking out of her window and like having the fence moment where she looks out in the world, her aerial moment. She has a very aerial type
Mm.
story arc, but if Triton had been murdered. um she is also top billed in this cast, interestingly enough, even though she is not what I would consider the star of this movie. She is top billed, so I'm just kind of going in order of how they're billed. Paul
Mm.
Sorvino as Ratissimo Roddy Largo, who is the ailing founder of Gene Co. that has all over your organ-based needs until you default on payment. One of Paul Sorvino's last roles, and as a baritone bass, I was very impressed. I did not know Paul Sorvino could sing. I really think of him as like a mobster type. So it was really cool to
Mm.
have him playing not just pure evil, but someone who also knows what movie he's in and is not above the genre that he's in. Sometimes when you get stately actors playing in genres that they're not sure about, they really don't go for it. But Paul Sorvino in At the Opera tonight, where he's like having his women servants like cock their guns in time with his like musical tirade. It's great. It's art. It's poetry. It's everything you want. And he's great at manipulating. He spends the entire movie manipulating people until he can no longer do it. And honestly, Paul Sorvino is a really good weight in this film. Sometimes an actor can be a weight that weighs a movie down, but here you need someone like Paul Sorvino to play Roddy. I can't imagine how it would work in a stage show without Paul Sorvino. Like I can't picture how
Mm.
anybody else could play Roddy. I don't think I've seen a Broadway actor that I can think of that even Jim Broadbent in Moulin Rouge as Zidler is like maniacally kind. I can't picture anyone else playing Roddy. I don't even know what that would look like. So
Mm. I know what you mean. It's the same with how um my brain sometimes. I know the perfect examples, but I just forget people's blasted names. The chap that played Frankenfurter in Rocky
so
Horror.
Tim
Oh, what was
Curry.
it? Tim Curry? Yes. Oh, for Christ's sakes. Yeah, there's been other great people that have played Frankenfurter, but some actors just make the role and become iconic within
Uh,
it.
and Tim Curry did originate that role too on stage. So he was Dr.
Mm.
Frank in Rocky
Yeah.
Horror Show. So like
Mm.
he knew the role when they cast him in the film, so,
Yes.
which helps. Yeah.
The, just a quick thing about Rotty, like it's just perfect. Like if you wanted a name that just signifies what this film is about, what Repo is about, like that name just yeah.
He
And his
also
influence
yeah.
actually in City. Sorry, go on.
Uh, no, yeah, his influence is great. He also is the lowest voice in this cast. Even when the grave robber is growling, it's above Paul
Mm.
Sorvino's tone. And so when you think of this just musically, also he fits in nicely as the ground floor of the show in a way, because sometimes he's lower even than the electric guitars. And so having him being like, I am the bass, the lowest of the show, I am the groundwork, and I am evil, and so all of you are doomed because I've doomed you. It works
Mm.
on a musical level, it works on a story level. He doesn't sing much, but when he sings, when he plots, when he talks, it's calculating and it
Yeah.
works. And he's really part of the revenge tragedy aspect of this. Like when I think
Mm.
about the Revengers tragedy, when I think about Chris Eccleston in that, I envision Paul Sorvino in Repo, and I think it works really well.
Mm. I the the thing of you mentioned him as being this Godfather-esque character does match quite well into that tragedy element. Sort of like the whole thing of like inheritance, the unworthy heirs, the political maneuvering and stuff like that, and involving innocent people that have nothing to do with this in your business and
Yeah.
such. That sort of all comes together narratively and conceptually to pretty much make sort of like an epitome of such a tragedy.
Which, by the way, I love too, because I don't know
Mm.
if it's a short-sighted thing because we never got the prequel, but the
Mm.
idea that he hates his children and he doesn't want to leave them anything, you gave them the ability to be that. Like, that's the entire doom of the movie for him, is that whatever his kids were, they are monsters because he's allowed that leash to go out that far. When he tries to push back
Oh
on
yeah.
Carmela becoming Amber, she just ignores him completely. He has no teeth against them. His one son is so angry that he just murders people for fun, and the other one is so much of a Lothario that he's just lost him to like this weird carnal decadence. But he created that. Like, that's the garden in which his flowers grew. So
Yeah.
any evil reflection of the by the way, originally Roddy was not in the original show. Roddy Largo is not the dad. That was a change in one of the later versions of the musical and then
Mm.
in the movie. But there's a version of it much earlier where he's just like one of the brothers, and Amber Sweet is like Luigi's kid, which adds a whole nother level of creepiness to the idea of the film here. But
Oof.
originally it was not exactly this, but I think it works with him as the dad and these three kids as like reflections of society, and also his inability to not calculate, because I can just imagine he drove them to this. It's very Trumpian.
Mm.
There's something very
Yeah.
Trumpian about Roddy Largo, which is why I'm kind of glad this was done in 2008, because I don't think I could like a movie musical that would have such an on the nose Trumpian character in like
Mm.
2020, because like having lived it, it's not fun, it's not sexy, it's not glamorous. I don't want that. But Roddy is
Yeah.
removed enough that he's not Trumpian. He is Trumpian, but he's removed enough that I don't have to think about him that way.
Yes.
But
I mean that.
the
Yeah.
comparisons bear.
So,
They're definitely there.
oh yeah. I hope you don't continue making this comparison too much, sir. That
No,
that's an insult to dear Rotti or whatever his name is to compare him to the other thing.
I know, but it is a part of the revenge
I
tragedy
know.
genre, is the heads of state that are irreparably evil for their time and doing things
Yeah.
outside the norm, and this
It's
is what they reap. And then Nathan Wallace, Anthony Stewart Head as the
mm,
excellent, like, not quite bipolar, not quite schizophrenic, but something is definitely not all there by the time we get to Unleash the Monster.
yeah.
Nathan Wallace is probably one of the most kind of correct. It's in the tradition of an operatic musical character that is kind of that corrupted character. And I really
Mm.
love that because there's so much depth that we don't see, but in how he interacts with Blind Mag, the kind of stuff that he does to kind of put on his Batman like Repo Man outfit. There's something so tortured about Nathan Wallace, that he's really up there with some of those great tortured characters in
Mm.
musical theater, that really make a show work because they're so eccentric and so unhinged. Basically, Blanche in a Streetcar Named Desire, to be
Mm.
perfectly honest, and I think I absolutely love that.
Mm. There's something to be said about you said torture before.
Yeah,
There's something to be asked about the fact of how much the setting and the situation that this like population has finds itself within impacts them and drags them down into this corrupted miasma. Um, yes, there had been decisions made in the past by their forebears and by this great tragedy that led them all to this place in the beforehand. But it could very well be that if they if Nathan had found himself in a different era, he would have been quite an upstanding person. He might have been very much a Giles,
yeah.
shall we say. Um,
That's how everybody
But
always says it. Is Giles turned more evil? Everybody always compares him to Giles because
yeah.
he had just finished playing
Mm.
Giles. Like I think there was like a year between these two things. So it was always like Giles is now doing murder. Essentially, is how people put it.
Ooh, so this is Giles unhinged.
Yeah,
Yes.
I love to because here you can see where the set design works. The
Mm.
entire house is set up to be a mausoleum. And so basically, he's locked his daughter and himself in a cemetery. So by the time Blind Mag is knocking on the door after Nathan has been like, no, she died in childbirth. Um,
Mm.
so Blind Mag hasn't visited before. The whole thing has a mausoleum bill. She's literally knocking at a gate. It's its own little private cemetery. I think he actually like literally breaks a mirror with his hand. And I always say if there's a broken mirror in a film, it's queer symbolism, and it's just amazing. Um,
Mm.
there's something so on point about we never really get to leave the graveyard because even the bright lights of the opera later on still have this like very weird I'm going home Rocky Horror Picture Show finale energy.
Yeah.
But you never really feel like you leave the graveyard because you never really do. The streets of the city don't feel
Yeah.
like the streets of a working city. We never see anybody doing a job outside of Blind Mag singing. Like she is the only one in this town that works, except for like the guy that does the newscast broadcast.
Or
But like the whole thing is decadence and decay. And it's like it's a cemetery on top of a cemetery, which is beautiful.
mm, which makes sense. Isn't it something like 99% of the world population's died
Yeah,
it
it
by the
was
time this happened?
it was
This
it
is
was
yeah.
a yeah.
Oh, sorry, go on.
No, it's not quite a pandemic, but it's like a mysterious disease origin. And we find out that through comic books. So the way that we open the story doesn't feel real enough so that it's a great kind of cinematic trick that wouldn't necessarily work on
Mm.
stage. That's the same thing with Pleasantville, where I don't know how you do this on stage. The comic book transitions and the comic book opening that are kind of part of this really do make it feel like you're away from it, so it doesn't feel so visceral that you can't enjoy it. And I think that
Mm.
is what makes this work and sets it apart from Rocky Horror Picture Show. Because even in shadow casts of Repo Genetic Opera, even when the cast is like right in your face singing at you, you still feel a little separated from them. You still feel
Mm.
like you're watching a cautionary tale instead of being in the bedroom with Frankenfurter while he's seducing the two leads. Like I think that there's something about the comic book transitions that work here that keep it far enough away that you can enjoy it without being like, most of the people that reviewed it poorly couldn't take themselves out of it, and like the visceralness of it was a problem, but the visceralness is beside the point. This is a story
Mm.
of how we've doomed ourselves, even the people that survive. This is basically The Walking Dead meets Evil Dead the musical, and I think it works in a lot of ways for that reason.
Mm. Um, yes, you could argue that this is either a fable, an Aesop, or you can even view it as a sort of a waking nightmare almost. We've ended up in this horrible, terrible place, and it's become a mire that no matter what these people are trying to do, they just keep getting sucked in, or they're not able to find closure or solace. They just it ends up as a tragedy.
I do think there is a fable element that is appropriate, not just because operas tend to be really long fables, but the
Mm.
whole conceit of Devil's Carnival is that after the people have died and they descend to hell for whatever reason, they are confronted with their lives as fables, essentially, and punished to be a fable. So there's something in Terence Dudnik's work that is religious, but also has that small fable allegory moral core to it. Um, for
Mm.
as much as there is no morals in Rebuild Genetic Opera, I think the center of this movie, if you had to find a place with a heart, isn't I Never Knew I Loved You So Much at the end. I think it's Chase the Morning, where Blind
Mm,
Mag is reaching out for Shiloh and Shiloh is reaching back, and then Nathan interrupts. It's the idea of interruption, it's the idea of
mm,
imperfection. It really reaches to a 17-year-old teen that's finding out how imperfect your parents truly are and how little they
yeah.
know. And also feeling like not being ready for a very, very big world, even if you feel like you are and you're clamoring for it internally.
Mm,
Um,
yeah.
Sarah Brightman is amazing.
Oh yeah.
I don't know how
Mm.
Terrence Didnick got Sarah Brightman for this casting because obviously she'd been Christine for so long. She was so well known. I don't know how he did it. However, he did it. However, he got her to play Blind Mag. Maybe she was like really up for it and heard Chromagia and was like, yes, please. But Sarah Brightman as Blind Mag, as like a person that knows she is doomed, knows she has no time, knows she's made a deal with the devil, but is still going to go out on her terms. All of that. Love
Mm.
it. I can imagine she had the most fun because it feels like she's got that Beyonce fan wind energy the entire movie long. Even with prosthetic eyes, there's still so much emotion in her eyes. She really got what she was doing, just like Paul Sorvino, and I think they are sides of the same coin. Not in that they're manipulating Shiloh, but that Shiloh is kind of the center of their world in a way, even when she's absent.
Yeah.
Sarah Brightman, great piece of casting. I don't know how they pulled it off. It's like Alex Brightman in Beetlejuice. I don't know how any of that gets pulled off, but good for them. Glad it worked out because it really worked out.
Mm. And also great allegory with her eyes and such. Um, you, the company, have given me these eyes and allowed me to see, but it made allowed me to see your world and such. I'm going out on my terms, so I will take out my eyes, and thus signifying like she doesn't need those eyes to, see what things truly are like and
Yeah.
such. And it fades back into to the religious theming and that we've touched upon previously in this conversation. Um, I want to make a quick comment about Paris Hilton being in this movie,
Yes, playing
which,
herself. It's that's the character she plays. She plays herself.
yes,
She's in character the entire time.
plays she plays herself. And at first, I know that there will be some people that are surprised that Paris was in this, like judging by what they know of her and what she has, like her public image. I would argue, though, that Paris has always actually had this undercurrent of subversiveness in herself. I don't think we give her enough credit because she's done things like House of Wax. She did this. Oh, there was a couple of other things that she's been in that sort of break the mold on stuff. I think she has a real interest in um horror and thriller stuff, and so she likes to sometimes play she may be playing as type, but she also I think likes to play against sometimes what she's expected to be.
I think Amber Sweet is perfect casting. I
Yeah.
think so. The rumors behind the scenes were that Paris Hilton just came in and played herself and didn't do any work. I don't know if those rumors are true. I wasn't there on set. I will
Mm,
say Paris Hilton may yen to do stuff, but she's not Eli Roth. And I think she
mm,
knows she's not Eli Roth. And I don't
yeah.
want to besmirch her because I think of the three siblings, as much as Luigi and Pavi really have moments of their own, it really is about her because Shiloh is not a boy. Shiloh is a girl. So you can't help but do the parallel between Shiloh and Amber as kind of Roddy's proteges, as it were. She's the one that takes over the company because of Pavi and Luigi at the end. Amber canonically
Ooh.
takes over the company. Um, it's one of those things where, like, because Pavi and Luigi don't have alternates and they're just kind of there being sexual and aggressive, they're great color to the world, but they're not like if they weren't in the movie could still work. It wouldn't be as graphic, but like if you mark it up, you'd still have a very serviceable movie because they argue in other places in the film. Um, I don't know if I would have cast Paris Hilton because I would have wanted someone that could actually sing the song. The parts of
Mhm.
exaggerated anatomy she have are very breathy, a little too late 2000s Spring Breakers Lindsay Lohan type. I don't think she's bad. She doesn't fall flat in this movie, but you can't put Anthony Stewart Head and Sarah Brightman in a movie and expect Paris Hilton to shine through. Let's be honest about it. There's a reason she's not in Devil's Carnival. There's a reason we never see her in a Rob Zombie movie. She's Paris Hilton. The House of Wax
Mm,
remake, she was never going to be Caroline Jones. She was never going to be the woman that would go on to play the first Morticia Addams.
mm,
It's just one of those things where, like, in 2008, Paris Hilton was going to be a draw for someone that wanted to pretend they were part of the world and then could leave it like it was a vacation. And I think Paris serves that role because that's the role Carmela slash
mm,
Amber serves. I would love to see it on stage as intended. I'd actually love to see this on stage to see what Terrence intended and to talk with them as a fellow musical theater person because I'm so intrigued by this rock opera and how it tried so hard to do what Hair and Tommy did in their times because it feels both like a rock opera that is its own musical album, but feels like a rock opera trying to speak to a disaffected generation, like
mm.
Hair did and like Tommy did. So like I have a lot of questions, and if I ever meet Terrence the Dudnik for whatever reason, I would love to just be like have an interview and talk about Repo and Devil's Carnival and Hallelujah because there's something great that reminds me kind of in the early 90s when we were still doing
Mm.
individual superhero movies. They had Spawn, and I feel like there's a lot of what I
Yes.
loved about Spawn that is here. Not Blade, Spawn.
Mm.
There's something very Spawn. This is like Spawn the movie musical. And I think that people are still celebrating Repo, and I think that's what makes it really interesting is that it doesn't feel like we celebrate Rocky Horror as much. It feels like it's still a big part of queer culture, but it's been around long enough now people kind of take it for granted. Repo feels like it's
Yeah.
something people discover over and over again. And then you find other people that love Repo, and there's like a recognition of what it is and what it does that you
Yeah.
don't get with Rocky as much anymore. It's still there, but it's been around long enough where it kind of feels
So,
like it's, yeah.
well, it's because as you say, it's been around for such a while now that it's sort of settled into being sort of the sort of gothic, gay, campy, over the top rock musical sort of thing. It's the example that people know about. And because of that, because it's so prevalent, it doesn't feel it needs to be like shouted out loud because people just like know about it or find out about it quite easily because it's shared so much. Um, I mean, that's why you've got the constant tours and such. Like they don't have to worry because people see Rocky Horror on the what's on at your local theater, and you will naturally get an audience coming to watch it.
Yeah.
Whereas Repo, it's it's not even 2 decades old. I think it's like 15 years old this year. Um,
However long
it-
2008 was, however long ago
yes,
2008. Don't
yes,
think about it too hard, but
it's
if you want to do
no, no,
math, came out in 2008. Later in
yes.
the year, so if you need like 2009 for the buffer, that's fine.
I know that sound like it sounds a lot to say 15 years, but that really isn't anything in terms of like, length of time and such. So that's probably why Repo still feels quite interesting and innovative and fresh. And it is the sort of thing that if it doesn't go down the traditional advertising routes, word of mouth is the way it's spread, like, and people discussing it like we're doing in this podcast.
Like
Um,
for final thoughts for me,
hmm,
there's a difference between Rocky Horror and Repo, not just in age, but
yes.
also Rocky Horror feels very insular. I mean, in
Hmm,
the beginning, it kind of feels very open, but it slowly moves inward into the different rooms in the castle.
yeah.
In Repo, we seem to move out of the cemetery, and even though the whole world's a cemetery, we
Hmm,
move out into the world with Shiloh. And so there's
yeah.
something much more open about Repo, and I think especially for people searching for something that didn't quite find it in Priscilla, don't quite find it in Rocky Horror, don't quite find it in Birdcage, and want that more
Mm,
rebellious, you get Blade Runner, you got Mad Max, and maybe you get Repo's Genetic Opera, but they're
yeah.
very different markets that serves. And I think Repo, in all of its imperfection, for people that love dystopia, that love cyberpunk, that like steampunk, that like Anthony Stewart Head, and
The
Buffy Gone to Murder, it really is a perfect like you had to. There are people still discovering it, but if you discovered it in 2008, 2009, when it was just coming out, it felt so underground and so different. And there's still no real competitor to it. There's not
no.
really a horror movie musical rock opera about dismemberment. I mean, you got Sweeney Todd, which is what we're going to be talking about next time. But
Mm,
even Sweeney Todd isn't as graphic. It does feel more hands off. It is about madness, but the way that you craft that madness can be really different in every showing.
mm,
Repo is so distinct that its shadow cast can't deviate from it. Like there are certain things you have to do that you can't take liberties with. Like you have to have a particular thing for
mm,
things. I just
yeah.
I really think Repo's Genetic Opera is special, and it's nice that people discover it, but it's nice that it still feels indie. I'm curious to know what the sequels are about, but also kind of glad that it stayed its own thing because I don't know if a sequel
Mm,
could stand up to the original. I don't know if it works as a trilogy, and maybe not everything does, And it's hard to say.
yeah.
If I ever meet Terrence, I'll ask and I'll find out, and I won't let you know, but I'll know, and that'll make me happy.
It it could well be that the reason that there's never been a push for sequels, at least with the film adaptation, is because of what we were discussing before about Terrence's stance against sort of what the expectations are of a film and such. And in all honesty, I do have an agreement with that. I am of the opinion that some stories do not need to, to have a follow-up, to have a sequel, to have the untold prequel sort of thing. Some stories are just perfect in their singular telling, like our window into their world. Even if this world in particular is full of madness and like chaos, etc. Um, Repo is one of those creations that, as you say, it's quite unique and it's definitely a product and storytelling of its time in the themes that it's sort of talking about and challenging. It reminds me a little bit of Beetlejuice in that we discussed previously that Beetlejuice felt like it doesn't have anything that quite matches what it has. Now, Beetlejuice and Repo are very different creatures in itself, but I think they would share quite a lot of commonalities and sorts in terms of the audience that would enjoy both of them for different reasons.
Yeah,
Um, and it's sort of just from that whole subculture that was crying out for representation and something to get their teeth into. And I wonder whether partially there's some fear about trying to write a story that adequately captures those themes, but is told well. But in this case, for the flaws that we've mentioned and such, it did come across quite well. And it gave people what they were wanting. And that's why it has gained cult classic status quite quickly. I do agree that I would love to find out um, Terrence's views on the cult status.
yeah,
But maybe one day if you do eventually meet him, you can find out on our behalf.
it's true. And I'll wear my sexy murder monster t-shirt. Because again, I know he's saying assassin murder monster, but it sounds like sexy murder monster, which I think
It's
is still very fitting for this show, really.
it sounds like a Lady Gaga album to be honest.
I would listen to Repo's genetic opera as done by Lady Gaga. I'm not even kidding. That sounds amazing. I had an amazing time with you today talking about Repo's genetic opera. I'm hoping some of our listeners will discover it for the first time after this and join in the cult status and movement. And you'll never get Zydrate Anatomy out of your head. And anytime anyone says Little Glass Vial to you, your response will be to echo it in Alexa Vega's voice. And it never fails, and it will happen for the rest of your life. And you are welcome for that. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on Everything is Gay, even the straight stuff. Maybe with a little glass vial, maybe not. But we'll see.
Indeed.